Good afternoon, everyone. I will call the December 10th workshop by the Johnson City Board of Commissioners to order at 1:03 p.m. We're meeting electronically. It is a workshop environment to discuss further the amendments that are being proposed by staff to consider, along with the passage also of the International Building Codes 2018 version. So, Mr. Peterson, I'll turn it over to you for an introduction, and then however you're going to carry out the format.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Mayor. As requested and discussed last Thursday evening, I've asked staff to prepare a review of the amendments to the ICC codes. And I've asked Dave to put this together, and I'm going to turn it over to him here in a second. And I've asked him to focus on the local amendments. As Dave has pointed out multiple times, the state of Tennessee adopted those codes with amendments. So whatever amendments they adopt, we have to adopt. So what we really need to focus on here are the amendments beyond what the state of Tennessee has adopted. So with that introduction, Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you to make your presentation, please, sir.
Pete, before we get into the content, just a housekeeping, do we need to call the roll because it's an electronic meeting?
That would be best, please, ma'am.
Okay, would you do so, please?
I will.
Don't you need to read that little thing about how we're meeting electronically, blah, blah, blah?
I do. I'll have to do it from memory that we are meeting electronically under the orders. I think it's 65, 63?
65, I think.
I can't see.
The governor's executive orders.
Okay, the governor's executive orders that we're allowed to meet electronically. There are certain rules that we must follow, which is calling the roll, and if there is a vote, it must be a voice vote as well. This meeting will also be posted on our website for review at a later time for those who are not in attendance today.
All right, Commissioner Fowler.
Here.
Commissioner Hunter.
Here.
Commissioner Murphy. Here. Vice Mayor Wise.
Here.
Mayor Brock.
Here. Thank you.
All present and accounted for, ma'am. Dave, if you'd like to go ahead with your presentation, please, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you. Wendy, do I have the ability to share? Yeah, I see a highlighted share button there, so that's what I'm going to do.
Yes.
I've put together a summary that I think is going to be a helpful guide. Let me put this into a presentation mode here so that it's focused. Okay. As Mr. Peterson said, I'm going to focus this on the city-specific amendments, and I go into I give a summary of each in green. The black text is the amendment as proposed. I'm also addressing appendices as adopted with the specific codes. And please interrupt me at any point in time. That's what we're here for, so you all can feel like you've got a firm understanding of what's being proposed. I'll be glad to go into whatever level of detail you need outside of the summaries here. So to begin, and this is sequential as it is in the ordinance proposed, the first on the list is the International Building Code. So the International Building Code is what governs commercial construction. We are proposing Appendix D, the fire district, be adopted with this. Now, these appendices must be adopted to be recognized. Appendix D is in relation to our fire district. Our fire district is centralized downtown. The appendix gives a great definition of how it is to be applied. It is applied to land that is densely built upon and also contains high hazard occupancies such as restaurants, nightclubs, bars, things of that nature, places of assembly. So buildings that are tightly together that contain lots of people are primarily what constitutes the fire district. And what the fire district does and the appendix does is primarily regulates combustible materials on the exterior of buildings. So basically, if one building catches fire, they don't want it to spread easily to the next, therefore, putting a great number of people at risk. We've had this in place for some time. There's not typically very much hardship with it. To be honest, I'd say the greatest hardship is when folks decide to build out on the rooftops. That seems to be the biggest hurdle we've come up against. But there are solutions inside of the appendix. For example, if you build in limited area and with 2x materials, so that it has a larger piece of lumber, you can build on rooftops. Basically, what they want that to do, they don't want you to use typical thin decking. They want it to be something that would char and then not spread easily. So that's Appendix D on fire.
So Dave, just so I really truly understand this, Appendix D is a part of the International Building Code, and then we must adopt it separately in order to enact it. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right.
And we have the location of the fire district outlined elsewhere within the code. It's also within Chapter 12. It basically says it applies to our downtown area.
But the
So-
appendix that we're adopting is the version from the international code, correct? We haven't modified it. We're just adopting it.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
So are the additional regulations that are primarily restrict combustible exterior materials, are those clear? Are those laid out? Is that the only thing that's included in Appendix D, or are there other regulations that are being covered under that appendices?
That's primarily it. It basically says if you're going to build structures on rooftops, they must be non-combustible. You can use non-combustible materials up there. If you put plastics or foam materials on exteriors of buildings, they have to be treated in such a way as that they don't have a easy flame spread. Any roofing material has to have a specific flame spread. Most materials have fire ratings associated with them, and they make sure that anything that you put on the outside is either treated, something that can char, or something that won't burn.
I think the main thing is that we really understand where these are coming from, and then are they clear to the builder as to what those additional regulations are?
Yeah, I feel the Appendix D is really straightforward.
Okay, thank you.
The next modification that we're, I say modification here because it's a clarification in the form of an amendment. Chapter 13, energy efficiency, is deleted, and International Energy Conservation Code as adopted in Section 12 of this code shall apply. So the IBC contains Chapter 13, which is energy efficiency. It is only a chapter. It's compared to the energy efficiency code, it's a summary. So it's very brief compared to a completely different additional code book. This simply says, don't use Chapter 13. Go ahead and go to the book so that there's no confusion or overlap or anything of that nature. The state does address or adopt the IECC, which is the energy code, the whole separate book. The state adopts that. We're simply doing this as a matter of clarification. That's done in several other places too, and I'll explain that when we get to those portions. That's it for the International Building Code. Move on to the residential code. It has Appendix Q, which is tiny homes. Tiny homes have over the years been a topic that people want to explore more and more. Unfortunately, without the appendix, there are many aspects of tiny homes that are not able to be built. If you were to use the IRC without Appendix Q tiny homes, you would not be able to do things like put in ladders, used loft spaces. They give reduced ceiling height requirements, things of that nature. They allow you to build more compact as a result of the regulations of Appendix Q. And because we have been asked about, there hasn't been extensive development in the tiny home industry in Johnson City, but there are frequent questions about how do I go about it. And this will just help folks that want to do that accomplish it within the framework of our adopted codes. And Appendix Q is we're not proposing any changes to it. We want to adopt it just as the IRC has it written. The next modification is, again, a clarification. Inside of the IRC, the residential code, there are several chapters. Chapters 34 to 43 are all about electrical code. This is an example of folks in the county that want to adopt one book because they don't have commercial buildings to be concerned with. They only inspect residential. So therefore, they don't have a need to adopt a standalone electrical code. They can simply use chapters out of the residential code that applies to residential construction. Chapters 34 through 43 are actually an identical duplication of the NEC, but because we have the NEC adopted, because we also inspect commerciroll properties, we want to simplify and not have the overlap and go ahead and delete 34 through 43 and replace it with those same sections out of NFPA 70, which is the 2017 National Electrical Code. Same as the energy code that we spoke about up here. Again, right below that is the exact same scenario with the energy code in relation to residential. That's it for the residential code as it pertains to buildings. The International Existing Building Code, we would like to amend an exception that they have in the code. The code book allows buildings in the flood hazard area to exclude historic buildings. So it says if the building's historic, it doesn't have to observe any flood regulations. And unfortunately for us, our entire downtown is both historic and in a flood region. So if we were to keep this in here, someone could say, well, you know, we're exempt from all the flood hazard stuff and we don't have to flood proof our building. And we believe that that wouldn't be a good protection of property or life. You know, we want to make sure that everyone's kept safe and all the properties properly guarded against flooding in the downtown. So we would like to exempt or accept, we'd like to take this part out. So that way historic buildings also have to follow flood guidelines as they have been doing for some time now. The International Fire Code, it has all of the appendices. At the end of this document, I have a sheet that outlines the titles of those. If you guys would like to see what the subject matters that are involved there. I noted here that it's identical to Kingsport. Kingsport also has all of the appendices adopted. Would you guys like to take a look at that document that has them all listed out so you can see the topics, or do you feel comfortable with the likeness to that which is adopted in our neighboring community?
Can you send us that document?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Bear with me one second, I just want to make a note. Okay. And again, the appendices just really take items that are small or you know, maybe one section within the code that need to be expanded upon because maybe something has happened at some place in the country that calls for it to be noted in more detail. It just allows you to expand, just as you saw with the explanation for the fire district. The first section in the fire code that we would like to modify is the dimensions of the public roads. Basically, fire code requires access roads, which can be wider or larger than the existing public streets. This amendment allows Mr. Peterson to consult with the fire chief and determine if the road is a road more narrow than that which is required is acceptable. Many times it is. This saves the developer from having to build new, larger access roads and allows them to use the city roads that are adjacent. The city roads are already built to a standard that can withstand the weight of the trucks, of course. This just allows them to be a little more narrow. Typically, the fire code requires roads be very wide to set outriggers and do some large firefighting things with the truck that can be achieved on more narrow roads if considerations are made. So that's why the city manager and the fire chief are written in there to potentially address that. This is the section about the 100 foot from the nearest fire hydrant. As the chief had explained previously, one section of the new code actually requires this, but another section does not. And it's a new requirement. It hadn't always. So basically, we've had this amended for some time now, and the code has caught up to what our amendment was. However, the fire code does not address this thoroughly in every location that it's needed. I believe it was in relation to the standpipe. It doesn't say outright that it has to be 100 foot. It gives some leeway as to the jurisdiction to make that larger. Gray areas can oftentimes become problematic, and we would wish to just keep this consistent with both what we've done in the past and what's elsewhere in the fire code as to circumnavigate any potential issues. The mechanical code, we don't wish to have any amendments. We want to adopt it just as it's written. Fuel gas code, we have one modification to, and that is to not put gas lines in the same ditch as any other utility. So if you have underground electrical and you have a gas line that oftentimes on a construction site, they'll dig a ditch. It's not easy work to dig a ditch, so they'll wish to put multiple utilities in that same ditch. However, if there ever comes an issue where the gas line has even a minor leak, that gas can travel back up into the building along the other utility. There was actually a fatal explosion in Virginia in the late 90s that was a result of this. So we have in our ordinance, or even in this proposed ordinance, that those things aren't allowed.
Dave, if we could, got a quick question on that one. This is an amendment now. This is a local amendment.
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
So the International Fuel Gas Code 2018 edition, why would it not address that? I guess that's where I scratch my head. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. You don't put gas in with electric,
Sure.
water kind of stuff. Why wouldn't it be covered in the original code?
You know, I wish I could give you a definite answer to that. The best thing I could assume is that there are multiple ways to achieve that separation. For example, if you make sure that the lines are far enough apart and there's enough earth built up in the ditch between the lines, you can technically call it the same ditch and put them in the same ditch. I think it's just an easier way to address the problem without having, 4 or 5 different variables that all really say the same thing. I don't know why I don't make it this simple. I do know that it's recommended by some national boards. You can see I added here, the National Transportation Safety Board has been recommending this. So they support it. They put in all the utilities, of course, along roadways and give the regulations for that. That's where I thought this would be helpful to add that. It is nationally recognized. Why it's not recognized by the fuel gas code, I can't say.
Okay. So for our developments, let's say we've got a residential housing development getting ready to start, they would have to dig 2 ditches. So one for you can put water and electric in the same ditch?
Yes, ma'am. It's just the gas we want to keep separate.
It's just the gas. So they're digging 2 ditches. So their cost is going to be basically twice as much.
And they could be parallel. So, I mean, they could do them at the same time with the same equipment. It would be just a matter of time. But if they were to resolve this issue in any other way, it would also require time. So if they were to use any of the other tactics to keep the lines separate, it would add just as much time, in my opinion, as it would to simply dig a parallel ditch.
So would they have to
or
dig them-
just skip
would they-
gas?
Absolutely. Yeah, gas isn't absolutely required.
But if they separated it, would they have to dig a bigger ditch then?
They would either, so either it'd be two small ditches or it'd be one big ditch with a method to separate them within inside the ditch.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of a wash.
Thank you.
Can I ask Shane or Lisa how much you've encountered that and how relevant that particular amendment has been to you?
That is not one that's really given us heartburn, to be honest with you. I mean, in this day and age, you're dealing with so much infrastructure in regard to communications and irrigation and, secondary and primary electric and whatnot. So, I think this just goes in with that same conversation. There's always a way of doing a little more to make it a little better, and which ones are common sense and the ones that, we need to adopt, and which ones, should we stay clear of. So to answer your question, that is not one that's really ever given us heartburn.
Okay, thank you.
Joe,
Yes, ma'am.
I have Pat Weber with Ingenuity in my office, and he will talk about the residential side.
Yeah, I would just say that typically if we put enough fixtures in a house, gas appliances, Atmos is going to run that line for us anyway. It's typically always in a separate ditch, and they take care of it all the way to the meter. So it's really not a concern for us at all.
Thank you for that.
The next is the National Electrical Code. The first amendment we have is means of identification. These are basically the colorations of the wires. There are industry standards that require, to say require and an industry standard in the same breath is not really accurate. They do this anyway as a standard in the industry, but the code doesn't call it out as something that's a requirement. So we add this in here so that there's no issue in the field. Someone could say, I want to use this whole color scheme for what I want to do on this volt system with this volt system. And unless we have this in here, we've got nothing to say that they can't, basically. And this helps whenever folks get into buildings that are already built. If you come back into a building post certificate of occupancy and you're doing work, you'll know right off hand without having to do any kind of research what exactly kind of system you're working on when you open up the walls and you see the coloration of the wires. I consider this one a matter of clarification to what the code has. The next two, I believe, yes, are about shut off. This was one of the ones that was generated by the fire in the John Sevier building. Regardless of that, I believe it's a very good amendment to have in place. Basically, it says if you can't shut off the power quickly from the outside of the building with a shunt trip is basically just an off button on the outside of the building, which is locked with a key that's only accessible by firefighters. So if you can't shut off the power with that, the main shut off for the building has to be within 10 feet of an exterior door. So basically, you want to open a back door, go into an electrical room, and shut off the power. So that's if a building's burning, and you want to be able to shut that down quickly, so they can spray the water on and then get personnel in the building, and no one has to worry about electrical shock or hazard. The second is the same. It deals in large complexes that have multiple meters or meter centers. The larger the meter center gets, we want to make sure that they're centrally located at least in certain groupings, and that whole group can be shut off with one switch instead of having to the firefighter on site having to track down where the different meter centers are and shutting them all off, taking extra time to do so. This allows them to cut the power to the building quickly in the matter of an emergency. This again is a continuation of the NEC. This basically says that commercial buildings, the electrical work in commercial buildings has to be located in metal conduit. The reason for that, it's helpful in several ways, and it's also a clarification. Most commercial buildings have to be in metal conduit anyway. There are instances where they don't. So if it were wood framing and it were of a low hazard, they technically by the code would not have to be inside of a conduit. We have found that encouraging electrical work to be in this metal conduit not only provides added safety, but it also provides the user and the building owner a greater flexibility for use of that space. For example, if someone had a hair salon or a what else could you have? Any sort of business. Let's say it's an insurance agency or something along those lines. And they did so well, they had to move to a bigger space. Somebody backfilled that space behind them, and they are a medical office or a physical therapy office, something where someone uses a piece of equipment that is connected to them in some way. That equipment has to be medically grounded. So if they didn't have metal conduit on their lines, they would technically have to rewire that area of the building completely to put in the medical grade of wiring. If they have it in metal conduit, they simply ground their new circuits to that metal conduit, and they can keep all the wires in place just as it is. It's basically an easier way to ground for flexibility of uses in the future. And that's it. We don't have anything else that we're proposing as far as Johnson City specific. You can see that here's the Energy Conservation Code. There are amendments. They're all state-based. Property Maintenance Code with no amendments, and Pool and Spa. In the 2018, previously Pool and Spa used to be a appendices or appendix in the residential code, and it gave you all the information about how high to make your fence, how the latch has to work, all the securities around having a pool at a residence. Well, since they took that out as an appendix, it is now its standalone code book, and that has to be adopted if you want to enforce regulations of safety around residential pools.
Okay,
questions?
Yeah, commissioners, any other questions or any questions of our guests who are attending this afternoon?
I would invite comment from any of our guests about anything that they've seen or heard.
You know, if I may, the only thing that I would probably bring up in going through the NEC amendments, I don't think I've ever heard electricians complaining about the coloring of wiring. I mean, you have to buy wire regardless, right? Maybe a little more tedious labor-wise, but I've never heard anyone complain about it. And the same thing, you know, I think everyone's aware from the John Sevier kind of some of the changes that were asked from that point. The 230.71A, as Dave knows, affects us quite a bit, and we've seen other municipalities and counties deal with it a little differently. It's, you know, it's not one that is major heartburn because you're talking per service. You know, if you have to have a disconnect that ties the two, we get into some of our really large buildings we build, so your feeder wires are not so long. It's more efficient cost-wise to have and it's a lot less labor to kind of have a service on each side of the building. And so they'll make us have signage up that would allow, whether it be a fireman or electrical person, let them know that there's another service on the side of the building. So, you know, that again, it's back to that balance act that I was talking about, that it's tough. Does every municipality have that? No. In fact, probably more of the ones we built in don't have that necessarily, but is it a huge ordeal in the general scheme of thing? Again, it's the really high dollar ones, I think, that get the attention. That's not one that probably I would spend a lot of time. We'd love to see it not be in there, but you're not going to see me rant and rave about it either, I guess. But other than that, I think everything was, there's certainly amendments in here that help and make things more cost effective, as there are a few that are going to cost you a little money too. And I think that's always going to be the balance that's just, up to future city commissions to deal with as we continue to adopt new code. Hopefully we can keep it as minimal as possible.
Good. Thank you, Shane. Lisa or Ben?
I think Shane summed that up pretty effectively, Mayor. Again, a lot of these in other areas are already kind of being taken, as I've stated several times, they're already here. So as far as a commercial standpoint, we're dealing with them now, and it's not going to affect our operations or anything like that.
Okay. Dave, could you go ahead and close your screen share so we can see each other again? There we go. All right. Lisa, did you have any final comments, or your guest who was with you?
He said, don't make him. Our biggest thing was the arc fault circuit interrupters having to do with refrigeration and it being mandated throughout the entire house. Being able to do ground fault on those was our big thing. And that was addressed with both Tennessee and then through you all. So as far as we go with the electrical codes, we're happy with what is being adopted.
Okay, very good. Pete, we'll kind of turn it back to you as is this, do we have other things to address, or is this the totality of it?
Mayor, can I ask one other question? I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
Dave, and this got brought up to me, and this goes on the other side of it, so I have to eat crow a little bit, but this is actually an amendment we used to have, and I didn't see it in there. And I was just curious. It was ordinance 4509-13. That probably doesn't mean anything to you, but it was in regard to the, it's in the IBC, I guess, where you would have Group E applications that did not have a sprinkler system for their rated corridors, that I guess the fire chief and the marshals used to be on board in the past, that would allow to have wired smoke detectors instead.
Absolutely. I can speak to that. So basically it was a very narrow window. I think it was roughly, it was a square footage thing between 3,000 and 5,000 maybe. Does that
That's
sound
correct.
accurate?
That's correct.
And it was for basically, if you have a corridor where 30 or more people travel through that corridor, it has to be rated. And if you're retrofitting a design into a former space that didn't have that, and then now it does because of the retrofit, they would accept an alarm system in lieu of rating the corridor. There has been a better understanding had of that situation, where previously the occupant load was interpreted as the total occupant load. So let's say you have a 5,000 square foot business space with 3 exits, and that would equal 50. It's 100 square foot a person, so you have 50 people in there. And automatically with that, they'd say, okay, all these hallways have to be rated because you have more than 30 people. Well, there's a section in the commentary of the code that helps clarify and says, if you have 30 people who use that hallway at the time of egress, so you actually have to have 30 people going through that specific hallway to draw that need, which is a rarity. You usually get over the balance between the requirement for exit numbers and occupant load typically relieves that situation. And it was becoming kind of a crutch, and we weren't looking at it correctly. So we eliminated it. And it was just such a fine zone between 3,000 and 5,000 business only. Whenever there were so many people in a specific hallway, Lori liked to use that one a lot, and it was becoming used less and less, and sometimes used in the wrong instances. So with the clarification in the code and its infrequency, and in an attempt to eliminate as many amendments as possible, we chose to get rid of that one.
Right. So if I understand you right, it sounds like the new understanding is going to still allow for some, I guess what happens in some applications, we've got a small office building and we're remodeling that for a new tenant. And so you're changing some things, but you didn't have sprinkler system in that building.
Sure.
And now your hands get tied a little bit, and all of a sudden you got to find sprinklers to it to abide by the new code because of this remodel. But if I understand you right, the way we're understanding that is more than likely the count that we understand to go through that corridor is probably much less now the way we're doing the math. So this shouldn't come into play too much.
That's
anyway.
correct. Right.
Gotcha.
And in a business occupancy, you can actually gain, you can have a gigantic occupant load. I don't even think there's a threshold for sprinklers.
Dave, but
yes.
what created that ambiguity or reconsideration was the 3 exits, wasn't it? That you were basically taking your 50 people and now they're not all going to go through one door.
Right.
They're going to split 15, 16, 17 people to each door.
Correct. And they,
so Shane could be doing an office, and if it only had one point of egress, if it had enough square footage, would it?
Well, there are other things that come into consideration where once your occupant load goes up, you're required to have more exits. And then you also have travel distances that you can't exceed. So
Okay.
once you kind of balance all of those things out, the frequency of that being an issue that was being helpful for was greatly reduced.
Okay.
I'll pass that along. Thanks for that clarity.
Thanks, Shane. Thank you, Dave. Pete, do we have anything else? Is this the totality of these amendments and appendices that we needed to review?
We did that in a half an hour.
We
Thank you,
did.
Dave.
How about that? Dave, you're good. I don't know if Pete hears me or not. There we go. Go ahead, Pete.
I was having a hard time getting the mute button to work.
Somebody lean over and hit Bernie. Wake him up.
That's what we had advertised for the workshop today. So Dave, are there any other amendments or changes that we have proposed that we haven't covered today?
Not outside of those that are also adopted by the state.
Okay.
Oh, there's actually in the front end, there's some housekeeping on in the ordinance. There's some housekeeping on old code language. I believe there's a reference to a 97 plumbing code and things of that nature. There's some striking of verbiage that no longer pertains. That's also on the front end of the proposed ordinance as well. Nothing to do with amendments though.
Okay. Are there any other questions then? Well, thank you, Dave. You've done a great job. I understand it a lot better, and hopefully everyone else has. Shane and Lisa and Ben, thank y'all for coming in again with us. It's been really helpful to be able to kind of go back to a consumer and ask what the input has been. So thanks a lot for that. I don't guess if we don't have any other business on this, I will just mention, even though it's not on the agenda, it's just FYI, if you haven't heard already, Liberty Bell and Indian Trail would go on full remote starting tomorrow due to COVID issues with staff. So just FYI.
And the issue being they just don't have enough staff to cover the classrooms because of quarantine and.
It appears that it says because of staffing issues. And I did speak with Steve Barnett yesterday, and he said that was one of the big challenges. My grandson, for example, has had 4 different teachers in his 2nd grade class at Fairmont, just in the last kind of 6 weeks almost. Yeah, it's tough.
We're 10 bus drivers short. So we would have probably called Steve today and asked him to have gone remote because we can't move kids. So ironically, the timing kind of matched up. It's very unfortunate, but I'm sure some of you are experiencing the same labor shortage in your businesses because of quarantines and positive tests. And, it's people getting sick, it's people dying, it's people working above and beyond in healthcare, but it's everybody's business is suffering because there's not enough available labor to get all the tasks done that need to be done for business. This thing's impacting every aspect of society right now. It's a tough environment. It's not getting any better. Numbers went up today.
Yeah, we won't be able to get the economy back screaming again until this virus is harnessed. So one's dependent on the other for sure. So
I don't know. My wife seems to shop really well from.
Well, I'm going to leave
Yeah.
the meeting so I can go wash my hands and put my mask back on.
all right. Well, thank y'all so much. Pete,
Thank
thanks
you.
for pulling this together. It was very helpful.